Hello everybody, welcome to jurycentral.com online classes for law exams. So today I will be dealing with you the solved subjective questions of ILI CAT, that means ILI LLM entrance examination of the year 2019. Yesterday I have uploaded one video in which I have discussed the latest subjective questions of 2020. So those of you who have missed that session, kindly watch the video. It is there in the playlist. I have already created a playlist in the name of ILI CAT 2021. So in this video, I would be discussing with you a total number of 4 subjective questions. So let us start. Question number 1, briefly discuss interpretative evolution of right to life and personal liberty under the Indian Constitution. So first we'll start with the introduction. Article 21 of the Indian Constitution states, no person shall be deprived of his life and personal liberty except according to the procedure established by law. This essentially means that every person has the right to life and liberty, and to be deprived of the same, the important elements need to be satisfied under Article 21. It means that although according to Article 21, no person shall be deprived of his life and liberty, but there are certain exceptions under Article 21. And what are those? Let us see. A, there should be a law subject to which a person can be deprived of his or her life and liberty, and B, such law should have a prescribed procedure. So there has to be a law which prescribes for the deprivation of life and liberty. The scope of Article 21 in interpretational sense has a vast ambit. It finds its origin in the human rights jurisprudence in India prior to the landmark case of Maneka Gandhi versus Union of India. It was followed that Article 21 was guaranteed only against the arbitrary action of executive and not from legislative action. However, this landmark judgment by Supreme Court guaranteed the right to life and personal liberty to be protected from both executive as well as legislative actions. So, this Article 21 actually safeguards a person's life and personal liberty against the actions taken by the executive as well as legislative. Further, Article 21 cannot be suspended during emergency, whether it is national emergency under Article 352, state emergency under Article 356, and financial emergency under Article 360. As no person shall be deprived of his life or personal liberty except according to the procedure established by law, now Article 21 encompasses within itself a vast variety of fundamental rights, though not expressly said but are considered inclusive in Article 21. So we'll see what are the other rights which are included in Article 21. In the landmark case of A.K. Gopalan versus State of Madras, first time the word personal liberty was defined. In this case, A.K. Gopalan was detained under Preventive Detention Act 1950. He challenged the validity of his detention. Fazal Ali Justice gave his dissenting view and held that a law which deprived a person of his personal liberty must satisfy the requirements of both Article 19 and 21. In the landmark case of Kharak Singh versus State of UP, it was held that personal liberty is not only limited to bodily restraint or confinement to prisons only, but also used as a compendious term, including within itself all the variety of rights which go or make up the personal liberty of a man other than those dealt within Article 91. So, the personal liberty is actually much more beyond the scope of Article 19 Clause 1 as it was held in the case of Kharak Singh versus State of UP. Conclusion. Thus, in the light of interpretational scope, we see that Article 21 is not restricted only to literal meaning. It also encompasses a huge domain and also incorporates Article 19 and Article 14 in its ambit. Right to speedy trial. It is a fundamental right of every person to have a speedy and expeditious disposal of his or her case. This simply means that the access of speedy justice is a fundamental right. So these are the scope of Article 21. These rights are the scope of Article 21. So first one is right to speedy trial. And the landmark judgments are M.H. Hoskar versus State of Maharashtra, Husainara Khatun versus State of Bihar. Then comes right to life with human dignity. It is also part of Article 21, and the landmark judgment is Francis Corelli versus Union Territory of Delhi. C. Right to clean environment, MC Mehta versus Union of India. Landmark judgment in CNG vehicles case, Taj Trapezium case, oleum gas leak case, Kanpur Tranneries and Spam Motors case. Then right against bondage, the landmark case is Bandhua Mukti Morcha. Right to livelihood, this is Olga Telly's case. Right to privacy, Govind versus State of Madhya Pradesh, and also case Puttaswamy versus Union of India. Then right to travel abroad, this Maneka Gandhi's case. Right against torture, Sunil Batra case. The right to legal aid, Sheila Barse case. Right to education, the state shall provide free and compulsory education to all children of the age of 6 to 14 years in such manner as the state may determine. That's what Article 21 says. Right to education in the light of Mohini Jain and Unni Krishna's case. And in the light of the landmark case of Vishaka versus State of Rajasthan, the prevention of sexual harassment and the right against sexual harassment in workplaces falls under the ambit of Article 21. So rights are actually the broader scope of Article 21. However, it should be noted that Article 21 is a right to life. The right to death is not a fundamental right and therefore is unconstitutional and is subjected to the provisions of Section 309 of IPC. Thus, Article 21 is to be followed in a positive construction and not a negative construction. So, in the last, it is said that right to life falls, it is a part of Article 21, but it doesn't include right to die. Then second question is, with reference to case law, discuss difference between murder and culpable homicide not amounting to murder. Introduction. Section 299 to Section 377 comprise of the longest chapter of the Indian Penal Code. This include the offences against the human body. They vary in a large range, differing only in the degree of their incidence of severity. So, this is the longest chapter of the Indian Penal Code from Section 299 to 377, and it deals with offences against human body, and these sections of these provisions actually vary in the degree of their incidence of severity. For getting into the base of the question, we need to understand murder, culpable homicide to murder, amounting to murder, and culpable homicide not amounting to murder. So first we'll deal with culpable homicide, Section 299, which is not amounting to murder. A person commits culpable homicide if the act by which the death is caused is done with the intention of causing death, with the intention of causing such bodily injury as is likely to cause death, or with the knowledge that the act is likely to cause death. Then comes a murder under Section 300 is an act by which death is caused is done. So this is murder. A, with the intention of causing death, with the intention of causing such bodily injury as the offender knows to be likely to cause the death of the person to whom the harm is caused, with the intention of causing bodily injury as to any person, and the bodily injury intended to be inflicted is sufficient in the ordinary course of nature to cause death, and with the knowledge that the act is likely to cause death or such bodily injury. Then culpable homicide not amounting to murder, then we'll deal with the exceptions. Clauses 1 to 4 of Section 300 contains essential ingredients of murder. There are 5 main exceptions in Section 300. If any of these 5 conditions, exceptions are complied with, then this amount to culpable homicide not amounting to murder. So Section 300 actually deals with murder, but there are certain exceptions. And if the case falls under these exceptions, then it is culpable homicide not amounting to murder. So the first comes grave and sudden provocation. Ingredients: no voluntary provocation, sought provocation as an excuse for killing, harming someone. So these are the ingredients and it should not be there for claiming this defense. Such provocation is not in obedience of the law, not given by anything done in the lawful exercise of the right to private defense. In the leading case of K.M. Nanavati versus State of Maharashtra, Parameshwara versus Krishna Pillai, Ajit versus State of Punjab, and Riyazat Ali versus State of UP, we see how grave and sudden provocation is an exception to murder. So these are the cases relating to grave and sudden provocation. Then next come private defense. Culpable homicide is not murder if the offender in the exercise in good faith of the right to private defense of person or property. So the private defense is extended to the right to secure the life of the person or property, exceeds the power given to him by law and causes the death of the person against whom he is exercising such right of defense without premeditation and without any intention of doing more than is necessary for the purpose of such defense. So here is this is the ingredient. So the murder or the killing of that person should not be a premeditation. That means it is not actually pre-planned, and the intention shall not be more than what the injury is actually necessary to prevent the harm. In the leading case laws of Nathan versus State of Madras, Jassa Singh versus State of Haryana, we see how private defense came in as an exception of murder. Then comes act of public servant. Culpable homicide is not murder if the offender being a public servant or aiding a public servant acting for the advancement of the justice exceeds the power given to him by law and causes death by doing an act which he in good faith believes to be true and lawful and necessary for the due discharge of his duty as such public servant and without ill will towards the person whose death is caused. So the example is like riot. So generally during the times of riot, the persons who are actually entrusted for the security of the state or of the place where the riot has taken place, they can take any amount of action to prevent that harm. Like they can also even shoot a person in the public to prevent them from causing any other harm or any more harm which is not anticipated. So such act of public servant is not a murder. In the landmark case of the Dakhi Singh versus State, we see the benefit of such an exception. Then sudden fight. Culpable homicide is not murder if it is committed without premeditation in a sudden fight, in the heat of passion, upon a sudden quarrel and without the offender having taken undue advantage or acted in a cruel or unusual manner. In a landmark judgment of Sunnu Muduli and the case of Narayan, and also in the case of Gappu Yadav versus State of MP, we can see sudden fight counts in the exception of murder. So sudden fight also comes in the exception of murder because it is because the fight has actually ensued in the heat of passion and there was no premeditation. Culpable homicide not murder when it is death by consent. This is the fifth one. Culpable homicide is not murder when the person whose death is caused takes above the age of 18 years, suffers death or takes the risks of death with his own consent. Like generally in those serious kind of operations in which a doctor undertakes the operation of any person and the patient actually consents to the operation to be conducted by the doctor, and eventually during the course of the operation if the person dies, then such medical practitioner won't be liable. In the landmark cases of Ambalati Asalinar and Ujagar Singh, we see how death by consent counts in the exception of murder. Then we'll come to the conclusion. Thus we can see how murder and culpable homicide can be differed. Culpable homicide not amounting to murder are the 5 cases of exception where the act is not deemed as murder. So there is a major difference between murder and culpable homicide. Then we'll come to question number 3. United Nations is increasingly becoming incapable of maintaining peace among nations. Discuss agreeing or disagreeing with the assertion. So let us start with an introduction. United Nations is an international organization tasked with maintaining international peace and security, developing friendly relations among nations, achieving friendly relations amongst nations, achieving international relations among nations and cooperation between them, and being a center for harmonizing the actions of nations. It took Birth on 24th October 1945 with the League of Nations being its parent organization. So on 24th of October 1945, United Nations actually came into force, and these are its main duties: to foster a harmonious relationship between the nations. Is UN effective? Ever since its inception, UN has tried its level best to achieve the objectives with which it was founded. Although the pace at which the work needed to be done is quite slow, however, it should also be understood that it is not an easy task trying to bring the developed and developing nations together at the table. It is a time-consuming, tedious and exhaustive process consisting of numerous conventions and conferences. Various international treaties are entered into and eventually ratified. So, obviously, UN has much more power in bringing the states and to come out with the effective solution to the issues which are faced by the nation, but it is not an easy task. It is actually time consuming because it requires numerous conventions and conferences and also international treaties which need to be ratified. Even after ratification of such treaties, there is a huge problem of implementation which is solved bit by bit. So this is a long time consuming process, and the United Nations is taking slow but steady steps to promote peace amongst nations. Another point to be noticed is that in the recent advent of globalization, privatization and liberalization has increased the responsibility on United Nations more to maintain world peace. The world has reduced to a global village, making it possible for a country nation to survive alone on its own. In these circumstances, United Nations actually doing a great job in promoting economic peace in the world in the era of LPG. So the main objective of United Nations is to promote peace amongst the nation, but alongside this objective, the UN has also been successful to achieve the economic peace in the world in the era of liberalization, privatization and globalization. Then comes another factor to be noted is that in this era, most of the nation states are armed with nuclear weapons. Any actions taken by any nation state may have a devastating effect on the world. The situation could go worse to the point that the existence of mankind comes into question. United Nations still now has been a commendable job keeping up with world peace between nations. So in this area, United Nations has actually done a very good job in keeping up with the world peace between nations. Let us take the example of the most recent phenomenon like environmental change. The United Nations started with Stockholm Declaration in 1972. Ever since then, variety of conferences like Rio Conference, Johannesburg Conference, Paris Agreement, etc. have been entered into. Although the process has been long and time consuming, but we can see slow and steady steps towards a sustainable environment. The reduction of the hole in the ozone layer, a result of Montreal Protocol, is commendable. So, the examples are also given, like how United Nations has actually effectively worked in bringing an environmental change by bringing into these conventions like Stockholm, Rio, Johannesburg Conference, Paris Agreement, etc. Conclusion. Thus, to conclude, we can say that United Nations has not reduced to a lifeless body incapable of maintaining world peace. On the contrary, it is very much capable of sustaining peace amongst nations and is performing its duties with utmost diligence. So this is the conclusion. The last question, write a note on critical positivism. So we'll start with an introduction. The term legal positivism finds its origin to the maxim jus positivism, meaning law simply and strictly so-called, or law set by political superiors to political inferiors. Then comes the policy and origin. The history of legal positivism can be traced to John Austin. John Austin, father of English jurisprudence and Austinian concept of law, applied the analytical method that law should be clearly studied and analyzed and the principle underlying should be found out. Austin defined law as the command of the sovereign. So legal positivism is a name coined by John Austin, who is also known as the father of English jurisprudence, and he has applied the analytical method that law should be clearly studied and analyzed. And he defined law as the command of the sovereign. According to Austin, there are two types of laws: proper law and improper laws. Proper laws consist of laws like law of God, human law, and positive law. The proper laws carry with it the sanction imposed upon it by the state. Improper laws, on the other hand, do not carry any sanction of the state. So, there is a major difference between proper laws and improper laws. Improper laws actually carry sanction, but improper laws doesn't carry any sanction. According to Austin, there are three elements of legal positivism. First is command, second is sanction, and third is sovereign. When we say law is a command of the sovereign, what we mean is that the subject should forbear from performing certain acts. So, command of the sovereign, law is a command of the sovereign means that the subject, that means the people, they should perform or forbear or actually abstain from doing something in case there is any disobedience in carrying out any such command. There is an implied threat of sanction, and if there is any disobedience like to perform or not to perform, then it actually attracts a threat of sanction. Sanction refers to the punishment, that means it actually attracts punishment, often for the non-conformity of the command. There are many reasons for the criticism to the school of thought legal positivism. Sanction is not the only means to induce obedience. By showing such deep compliance with sanction, the real character of law in a community is distorted. In this theory, law is considered lifeless and artificial. Therefore, the dynamism of law is not considered, nor in its spontaneous growth. So these are the nature of the law, which has been coined by John Austin. Then Austin's theory doesn't differentiate between goodness or badness in the area of law. Austin's principles are not applicable in the modern day scenario, and these are the drawbacks. Austin's principles are clearly inapplicable in a modern democratic welfare. The principle of legal positivism can only be applied to nation states where parliament is supreme and where there is no division of power between different organs of the state. It means that legal positivism is not suitable for a country like India, because here the people are the supreme, not parliament is the supreme. Austin's principle do not find a place in the international law because there is no concept of sovereignty in the international law. There is no place for precedent-based law in legal positivism. So, legal positivism doesn't recognize precedent-based law. In the Indian context, there are certain important laws which are created by judicial precedent, like for example, Keshavananda Bharati's case. And now we'll come to the conclusion. We thus have seen how the theory of positivism as given by Austin operates. Also, we, after having a close look at its principles, can also conclude as to why the principle of positivism are inapplicable in modern day scenario. So this is our session for today, and I hope you all have liked it. Do not forget to give a like, share and subscribe to the channel. Till we meet the next time, thank you and have a nice day.